let's go back to the yellow vests, but just one parenthesis, the fashion statement, since the last speaker is involved in fashion. Well, the yellow vest is a fashion that makes a statement. And the statement is, I work in the country, I work outside, I work on the roads. I'm the one that comes to your house to fix things. I do construction. And all of these things require protections. The people that I hate and that I want to overthrow all wear suits. And they're not out in France, they're in Paris, where they direct everything from the top down with incomprehensible administrative directions that pile up with paperwork that make the small artisan pay his taxes in advance before he's even made anything and sold it. And these people are hated in the same way that the aristocrats with their red heels and their high heel shoes and their doublets and hose and so on were hated. And so this is a very important fashion statement. And the statement says this: yellow vests, that's an emergency. That's when we're in danger. And we're wearing them and we're stopping traffic and we'll stop the whole goddamn country if we have to, because we're heading to hell in a handcart. And we're not stupid. We know it. That's why we don't vote. So these people who are criticized, there's a group here that's represented online that started a very interesting movement 2 years ago, which was called active abstention. And although it seemed a little odd to me, it turned out that they were right, because here's the biggest group of active abstainers, and instead of voting for candidates that they know will go off to Paris and not keep their promises, they're excluding all of those parties and all of those people. And they're saying, we're going to speak for ourselves. Now, this is not the first time in history that the common people have made fashion statements. In the 18th century revolution, the rabble in the streets were known as sans-culottes. That is to say, they wore trousers, mainly striped trousers in the cities, like people do today. But the bourgeoisie and the aristocrats, they had buckled shoes with high heels, and then silk stockings, and then breeches. And they walked around with swords and all the rest of that. Well, the French people have not forgotten the merciful machine of Dr. Guillotine. And you constantly hear them talking about it on the picket lines. So you've asked for some firsthand things. I'll tell you about what I did yesterday, which was the 9th Saturday. All right, first of all, my first Saturday, I was in the country. So I went out to one of those ubiquitous, the French won't have traffic lights. They have these traffic circles and they put them everywhere, which is ridiculous because they eat up land and so on. But nonetheless, the people were out there, just as they were out there at toll booths, letting people go through for free, and at shopping center parking lots, talking about all of the problems of that they don't have money to go to those shopping centers because the inequality in France has grown and grown and grown, and finally the people have had it. So the first sign that I saw was the day that there was an ecological march that coincided on Saturday with I think it was the 5th or 6th Saturday of Gilets jaunes, of yellow vest demonstrators. And what happened is that there was convergence between these two groups. Now, it's true that we can criticize the ecological movement as being a bit snobbish and bourgeois and not undertaking the serious analysis that shows that carbon capitalism runs everything and that's the main enemy. On the other hand, they're not exactly just about, oh, litter is our problem and we should pick it up. But what I saw on that day is that they had influenced each other. And the ecologists, many of them were wearing yellow vests and carrying signs that said, the end of the world, the end of the week. Same enemy, same solution. Because they had criticized the yellow vests with some reason and saying, well, they're just out for money. They're just out for the end of the week because they don't make it. Or really the end of, excuse me, I said it wrong. I'm an American. The end of the month. The French get paid by the month. So the end of the month, yes, that's our concern, but the end of the world is also our concern. The same enemy, the same solution. But not just to Macron, to the system. Because yesterday I saw lots of people with signs that said, Macron resign, Macron dégage. But then it said, system, abolish. So they're perfectly aware that if they get rid of Macron, they'll get another one, right or left or center. It's all the same thing. It's the Fifth Republic, which was set up by de Gaulle with a coup d'etat, and it's a very, very narrow and top-down system where representation is really a joke. So these people ain't dumb. And the one thing that they know about themselves is that they ain't dumb. And so they're not fooled by any of the propaganda. Now, it's true that they're a cross-section of France, which is an imperialist country and a very successful one, because it has not lost its economic colonies in Africa and has huge amounts of wealth pouring in petroleum and in precious metals and so on from their governments in Africa that they prop up with a very effective but small, nasty professional army. So that's the situation. But the yellow vests, to a certain extent, profit from that. And so the question of ecology and the question of imperialism and all of these things come together. But they're not being fooled. They know the huge profits that are being made by the oil companies, and they know that the government has for years been pushing them to buy diesel cars because government told them that they were more ecological. And then suddenly Macron comes out and says, no, you've got to change and we're going to raise the diesel fuel because that's bad or something like that. Come on. You know, these are people that work with their hands and that fix their own cars and they know what the hell it's all about. So it's true that they are a cross-section of the periphery of France. That is to say, the villages and the small cities and the prefectures in the 100-odd departments that France is divided into. And they're basically mad at hell because their lifestyle is being degraded, but above all, as Danielle said, because of dignity. They feel put down on by the suits, just as the sans-culottes felt looked down upon by the aristocrats and those that wear doublets and hose. And they're not going to give up. Now, let's look at some of the questions that have been asked. Can this go on? There seems to be absolutely no reason why it can't. It was predicted from the very beginning that the movement was peter out. And it's perfectly true that massive government violence against them was a big discouragement after the first couple of weeks. They're using militarized police, and France has the record for police militarization in Europe, where they use flashballs and gas, which is, by the way, outlawed by international treaty. And the CRS goon squad of political police, or riot police, actually, that are very, very nasty. And it's very, very clear that these things are done under orders. All right, eyewitness. Yesterday in Nîmes, which is a nearby medium-sized town, we decided to have a big demonstration in Nîmes. Well, here in Montpellier, we had a women's march where the women were first and where we actually registered to have permission to march, and the police left us alone. In Nîmes, on the other, very, very bourgeois town, huge numbers of people, maybe 6,000 or 7,000, that's big in a town like that, came out in the main square around the old Roman arena. And they weren't even chanting. They weren't doing anything in particular except gathering in a big crowd. And the police came in on all sides, trapped them, and then inundated them with tear gas and fired flashballs, which are basically big bullets that are fired out of a pistol. They don't have a very long range, but they're nasty. They'll knock your jaw off. And you'll see in what I've written a link where you can go and see the injured people. So the point about this is very simple. The woman that told me that, who I consider a kind of a very, very conservative, mild, petty bourgeois lady functionary, she'll never be the same again. The credibility of the government is for her completely done with. And when the radio and the television and the media go on and on and on about the violence of the yellow vests and say little or nothing about the massive violence against people, innocent people, people that are just demonstrating in a country where that's normally a tradition, you're not going to stick that genie back in the bottle. They are mad and they're going to stay mad. And yesterday in Montpellier, where I was, the guy standing next to me was telling everybody about Macron's latest speech, in which he said that the French people don't understand work. They don't understand effort. That is to say that they're lazy. He's talking for the class of, he talks from his office where everything is gold chairs and everything around it. It looks like Louis XIV. Maybe it was built by Louis XIV or maybe the 15th. In any case, the dissonance, the cognitive dissonance, he's lecturing the working people of France who have to have two jobs and who can't make both ends meet. And he's calling them lazy. Do you think there's any way that they're ever going to go back into the fold after that? So the indignity and the violence, and above all, the lies. Now, the yellow vests absolutely hate the media because the media hate them. The interviewers, first of all, most of the media, like in Paris, they shoot from the 5th floor of the buildings. They're not down there in the crowd where you can see what's happening to the people around you. And they pick the people that they interview. So in one instance that I saw, there was a guy that had a program, he wanted to say something. He couldn't get interviewed. And they finally picked somebody that was stupid and had right-wing opinions, and they interviewed that person. Plus, when they interview people, they try to convince them to answer questions like, well, isn't this all about taxes? Or isn't this all about oil, diesel fuel? And the people talk right back. They say, no, that's not what I was trying to say. And so they're utterly furious at the whole media profession, who are basically part of the same establishment. Now, Danielle was talking about bureaucracies. I disagree with one thing. There's huge amounts of capital in the French stock market, and it went up 15% in terms of profits, whereas they're pushing down every social benefit. But it's not the capitalism of one guy with a big fat cigar and a hat. Of course, it's totally bureaucratized, and Macron, who used to be a banker or an executive at Rothschild and then moved into the Socialist Party, which was putting in neoliberal reforms, and then became president on his own by a fluke because the other parties fell apart and he was the only one left standing up against the proto-fascist Le Pen of the National Front, now called National Resemblance or something. In any case, that class is easily recognized vestimentarily, financially, and in its arrogance. And that, again, is a genie that is not going to be put back into the bottle. But this is the first time in the history of France's 5 or 6 revolutions that I've studied where instead of coming from Paris and spreading across the country, or hopefully spreading across the country, it's converging on Paris. And these people, many of whom have never been to Paris. Yes, that's true. It's a small country, but a large number of people have never been to Paris. And they came to Paris for the first time as demonstrators. And of course, got themselves shot and gassed. And where did they go? To a place that I never go, and most of the people that I know never go, the Champs-Élysées. And it's true, they broke some windows of fashion shops and so on and so forth. And they tried to get as close as they could to the Élysée Palace, where Macron hides out. And they managed to scare one of his ministers to climb out the back window of his ministry, because all they did was break down the outside door. They never got any further than that. But here are people coming in from the countryside, and that's their idea of Paris. They're going to the centers of power and the centers of wealth. Now, if that isn't a kind of class consciousness, I don't know what is. Now, it's not identical with the class consciousness of organized labor, of industrial labor, of the railroad men and women and all the other big industries who have the power to strike and who are in direct conflict with the stockholders and the wealth that owns those companies, which are more and more privatized. But it still is class consciousness. And those of us who were very moved by Occupy in 2011, I thought the most genius thing about it was that they came up with the slogan, "We are the 99%. These people are the 99%, which includes, of course, the industrial working class. But they know that their enemy is the 1%. And in fact, on the sign that I saw at the first rond-point, it said 1/10 of 1%. And these are all crude handmade signs. So we're not talking about, a party that's sending down. These are people thinking for themselves and talking among themselves. Now, one of the first slanders against them, aside from being violent and black bloc anarchists and so on, and by the way, many of those so-called black bloc people are police agents. This has been going on in France for at least a century, and everybody knows it. And they've been filmed coming through the police lines, going and breaking something up, and then going back through the police lines and sitting smoking in a police wagon before being taken someplace else to do their dirty work. I'm not saying all of that. There are plenty of angry young people who have every reason to want to put on black clothes and break shit. But that's not where it's at. And people know that. And so being lied about, being beaten up and gassed, and then told that they are the violent, that's not going back in the bottle. That's another genie that's out. Now, we're worried about co-optation. We're worried about the influence of the right. And the first thing the government tried to do, and the media even more so, was pick out the FN people, the proto-fascists, the racists, and so on, who are in the movement more or less in the same proportion they are in the French population, which is not huge, but it's significant. But the attitude of the yellow vests from the very beginning was that they were bound and determined to keep their autonomy. And so they absolutely refuse participation to anybody that brings in party politics. And that goes as much for Le Pen's right-wing party politics as for the left-wing party politics. Now, the right wing has been beaten up and kicked out and definitely doesn't dare raise their party affiliations if they try to participate in general assemblies or in the internet conversation that takes place. They're known that they're not welcome, and sometimes made to feel not welcome brutally. Now, there have been among the demands problems where people are afraid of immigration. And that is something that needs to be struggled on. And somebody said, well, what can we do to influence the movement? Well, you have to be part of it. And what I'm doing with my Moroccan friends here and my labor friends here in Montpellier is trying to organize coordination between the North Africans and the other Africans and the immigrants in what they call the banlieue, and what we call the projects in America, and the rank and file of the yellow vests, who are, as I say, are a cross-section of French people who benefited from, consciously or unconsciously, from French imperialism and have all the prejudices of such a situation of white skin privilege. So yes, one thing we can do is bring them together. And what's happening right now, and that's the on the ground work that we're doing, is that now, after all of these big demonstrations and small things happening in every place around the rond-point, and is the organization of more and more general assemblies. So the people who have been talking informally in the process of demonstrating are now coming together, and there's a big project of a referendum and of a restructuring of French government and of a new constitution, all of these things taken from the history of earlier revolutions in the 18th century, for example. So they brought out, for example, the Cahiers de Doléances. Those are notebooks where people put their grievances in. And they've opened them up in every place where they could. Now, the government tried to take that over and have the mayors do it. And then, of course, they could pick out the grievances that they wanted to. But the yellow vests are not having any of it. They're doing them themselves. They're doing it publicly. And now there have been several calls that have been well received from small towns, one called Commercy and another one a suburb of Paris, to have a general meeting of delegates from the different yellow vest groups in different places. And so as to federate. Now, this is an old anarcho-syndicalist idea, and it's a very, very good one. And so it's starting to happen. And our push will be to try to bring in the racially oppressed and parts of French society whose grievances are double together with the rest. It's something that's got to happen eventually. And so we can help a little bit by making some suggestions and using our connections on both sides of that very, very difficult line. So, but they've been, the yellow vests have been very, very successful in keeping out political influences. Now, the biggest one that is trying to get in is Mélenchon, the leader of the, what do they call it, the unbowed French party. And he's a kind of a demagogue of the leftist variety. And he says a lot of things that the yellow vests are glad to hear, like denouncing government brutality and government lies and so on. But he is certainly someone who stands to benefit if this movement grows to the point where the government collapses and they call for some kind of election or thing. He's the electable person who, you know, who would be the next one on deck. But that's not what the yellow vests are about. They're not talking about replacing Macron, like the lady's handwritten sign said yesterday on the Women's March. No, abolish it. Abolish the administration and have democracy from below. You see it everywhere on the signs that people make up and are carrying. Now, the government's reaction has been first scorn and silence, and then violence, and then lies. Macron finally got on TV, and after telling people that he wouldn't use the word yellow vests, later he called them a vile mob. What is it in French? Une foule haineuse, yes, a hateful, vile mob, okay? Well, that'll get you in good with these people. It's unbelievable, the arrogance of this guy and of the whole class that he represents. So it's a huge cleavage in France, and it's cultural, and it's vestimentary, and it's political. It's a class division. And it needs to be broadened to be totally successful, because many of these people are what classic Marxists would call petty bourgeois, but they are working people too. Let's start two more things, and then we'll, all right. The question of organized labor. The French unions are in cahoots with the government. Let us remember that in 1936, the CGT and the other unions ended the general strike that during the Popular Front, and got French people their paid vacations and a few increases that were very considerable and were gone the next year. And that was because Maurice Thorez, the head of the communists, said to the French people, we must learn to end a strike. We have to learn to end a strike. That was the communist slogan. And at the end of World War II, when the workers were armed and the ruling class, the owners, were in disgrace because they had collaborated with the Nazis and sent their workers to work in Nazi Germany for free, Maurice Thorez, who had been in Moscow through the war, came back and he said, Frenchmen, roll up your sleeves. We must rebuild the country and then we'll have the revolution. And in 1968, as many of us are still alive to remember, they also pushed the workers, 10 or 11 million of them, on a general strike that had been sparked by a student revolt, pushed them back into work and signing, small raises and stuff like that that immediately got eaten up by inflation. And the slogan then, well, they didn't even have a slogan. What they did is that they went from one factory to another and told the workers that were in a sit-in strike and weren't in communication with each other, that the other people had already gone back, so you might as well too. So this is the CGT and the whole rotten crew of labor bureaucrats who the yellow vests correctly see as, like the media and like the parties, representatives that are imposed on them or that they get to choose once every 4 years, and whose job it is, whose profession it is, to sell them out, and over whom they have no control. So, as usual this spring, when Macron came down with a whole list of neoliberal counter-reforms, taking away much of what had been won at the end of World War II, the unions organized the most pitiful counteroffensive with little bitty strikes in local places and with what they call grève perlée, stop and go strikes that didn't hurt at all. They avoided confrontation for month after month, allowing the students to be brutalized and even the workers in demonstrations, and finally got their place back at the table with Macron, because he wanted to jump over them and impose by decree and he realized the unions are his best friends. So everybody knows that also in France. And the question is, many workers wear yellow vests, and many of them have come over to the movement. How that gets organized and how it gets turned into general strikes is the problem that we're going to have to face in the next month. But on the question of whether this movement is left or right, in my opinion, there's very, very little chance that right-wing elements can take it over. It's gone much, much farther than that. And week after week, the demands for participatory democracy broaden, and the suggestions, the word anti-capitalism is everywhere now, and it's not because of the little ex-Trotskyist party called the New Anti-Capitalist Party, which has been very suspicious. The whole left has been suspicious of the yellow vests, and for a very good reason. They're there to replace the left parties, whether they be far left or medium left, who want to represent them or tell them how to act. They're thinking and acting for themselves. Now, some of us on the line here were friends of Castoriadis, who was a very, very intelligent French or Greek theoretician of 60 years ago. And he talked about autonomy, and he talked about individualism and so on. And I think many of the things that he said were right. And among of his other visions, although very premature, was the idea that a country could be run from the bottom up through something like the internet, because he was a great reader of Norbert Wiener, among other authors. So all of this is in the realm of possibility. All of these are positive and powerful tendencies, and I don't see how they can stop. So yesterday's observation on the square of Montpellier was, what? Macron called us all lazy? I hope he stays in power. Every time he says something like that, more and more people come over to our side. And more times that they clearly have orders that peaceful demonstrations will not be tolerated. And so you go out to demonstrate, you're going to get gassed. And people are not about to put up with that. And even in the parliament and even among his own party, the tradition of freedom of the streets and so on continues in France. What else can I say about my observations? Yes, ecology, the end of the month and the end of the world. That's what we have to have at the same time. So the last part, we know that the movement is spreading all around. There was a huge general strike in India. I don't know how much it was influenced. You know, there's the air of the time and was influenced by France, but definitely in Belgium and in other places. And you know, France and Holland, Low Countries, voted against the European Treaty. And it was a big, big movement to vote no. And we won. And yes, it was a movement that combined the far right and the lefts to make up a majority for the no votes. Well, of course, that's the problem with so-called representative government. They simply jammed it down our throats a few years later by a Lisbon Treaty, which we didn't get to vote down. So all of these things are in the air, and people have long memories, and they're not going to let go of what they've already won. So let's sum up. What was won after the first, let's say, November 17th to the end of the year 19, my God, I'm showing my age, 2018, okay. The president, the administration, the government was unmasked and is now hated. Number two, the political parties of all stripes were pushed aside, and the very principle of representative republic which was favored by Hamilton in the American Revolution and was favored by the bourgeoisie in the French Revolution so that the people wouldn't be able to take over, that has been rejected. No one wants to be represented. We will talk for ourselves. So that is a major victory. And finally, the media have been totally unmasked, as Noam Chomsky and me and everybody else has been pissing in the wind trying to explain to people, but they knew it all the time. Even the left believed that the unwashed common people were hypnotized by the eye of the television and that they were made to buy things. Well, they had to buy things. If it wasn't one brand, it was another. And they were made to believe the myths that they were told on television. But they just kept it on to keep the kids quiet or whatever. They didn't believe it. And it's very, very clear now with the hatred of the media that's come forth and the creation of their own new media, which include both internet and general assemblies and federation. So those are, we're talking about hegemony, which is a word I only recently learned to pronounce correctly, if that is the correct pronunciation. What holds governments together? What holds societies together? Well, according to many, it's the prospect that the future might be better than what they're living through now, that their children might be better off than they are. But people are seeing, number one, that it's collapsing all around them. And number two, hegemony depends on the credibility of the government, of the media, and of the intermediate institutions to keep things going. And the yellow vests have stripped the masks and demystified all of those intermediate things so that it's down to a very, very clear questioning of hegemony, of the present French system, and by implication, the world system. Now, what needs to happen is that federation needs to spread not only throughout France, which is happening now, but from France to Belgium and all of these other countries. Some of this will happen by happenstance, but where in 2011, with the Arab Spring and the movement of the squares and Occupy and the occupation of Wisconsin State House and so on, all of those things connected, all of those things sympathized and inspired each other. This is what my friend, the historian Katsia Fikes, calls the Eros effect, a phrase he took from Marcuse. But Marcuse wrote One-Dimensional Man, and I'll never forgive him for that, because the yellow vests are proving that human beings are not one-dimensional, and that the fight for dignity and the common sense and intelligence of the great unwashed masses are not something to be scorned, either by intellectuals or by people like Macron. So these masks have been torn off. Hegemony is no longer necessarily a thing that's going to continue. And what will happen next could be a whole outpouring of participatory democracy everywhere. Even the police. The first day I was out on the Rond-Point, a lady nearly my age said that she had been talking with the police that were sent out, to keep an eye on them. And the cop said in her ear, "Keep it up, keep it up, keep it up." Well, partly he was thinking of himself, because the only people that really got a raise were the cops. The rest of the civil servants didn't. And when Macron went on television and said that, yes, he did have to recognize that I think that was the royal we had neglected the poor single mother with her children, who needs her car to go to work and so on. And so he made three promises about fiscal taxes and a minimum wage and so on. All of them turned out to be false promises, because the small people that are the yellow vests, they're not stupid, and they know how to add. And they immediately saw that behind that, there was nothing that was really being taken from the rich to be given from the poor. And one of the first people I talked to, again, out at that first rond-point in mid-December, said, "Don't give us words, give us figures." So they figured out that it was a lie. And people don't like to be cheated. They don't like to be cheated by men in suits, who assume an air of contempt and talk down to them. No, this is not going to stop. And we can talk some more about it. What I wrote, which is online on our wiki, and which I think Fred sent out to you in the form of a text, is a rough draft. I followed my own advice, which was to talk about then, the past, plagiarize. So I plagiarized my own articles and other people's, and I put them all in the past tense, and I systematized them, and it gives us, as of January 2019, a picture of what has already been won, the irreversible unmasking of the hegemonic government, the parties, the unions, and the system that is supposedly representative. And that is something, I think, a leap in consciousness that is enormous. And from there on, there's no telling what might happen. It might not happen this year. It might be put down and then come up again some other place. But as I said before, those genies can't be put back in the bottle.